It's commonplace in the international relations literature today and in the public sphere for people to argue that states are irrational. That's not to say that everybody argues that, or everybody argues that states are irrational all of the time. But you hear that more and more, and again, you see it in the scholarly literature as well. Sebastian Rosado and I thought this was not the case. First of all, if it is true, it has huge implications for international relations theory, because almost all international relations theories are based on the rational actor assumption. And if states are not rational, that's going to cause all sorts of problems for those theories. Furthermore, if you're in the real world, you're in the White House, you're making foreign policy, and you assume that you're dealing with a world that's filled with states that are irrational, how do you make policy? It's almost impossible. So our basic intuition to start with was that states are rational. And we decided we were going to investigate the issue. Now, what you have to understand, this is of great importance, is that to assess whether states are rational most of the time or irrational most of the time, you first of all have to have a clear definition of what rationality is. And it's remarkable how few people have a clear definition of what rationality is. But you can't assess whether states are rational without a clear definition of rationality. Okay? And then the second thing you have to do if you're going to engage in this enterprise, as Sebastian and I did, was you have to take that definition you have of rationality and run it up against the empirical record or the historical record to see whether states were actually rational according to the definition that you have. So that's the enterprise that we were engaged in. Now, when you look at the literature on rationality, there are two big literatures that are floating around out there. One is the rational choice literature, which is reflected in classical economics. And the other is the political psychology literature, which is reflected in behavioral economics, which is quite fashionable today. But you see people in political science, people who study IR, saying there has been a behavioral revolution in political science or in the study of IR. Those are people who fit in the political psychology camp. And then, of course, you have the rational choice people, which has also been a popular way of doing international relations scholarship over at least the last 3 decades. So these are the two bodies of literature that are out there. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how do they define rationality? Because you need that baseline, right? And it's quite clear that both of them rely on expected utility maximization. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly is this? Let's just start with the rational choice literature. The rational choice literature says that states act as if, and those words are very important, as if they were expected utility maximizers. Now, what exactly is expected utility maximization? It's actually a magic formula. In many ways, it's a brilliant formula, but it's a magic formula that was invented by von Neumann and Morgenstern back in the middle 1940s. And it says that rationality is employment of expected utility maximization. And expected utility maximization involves coming up with different policies to deal with a problem. You've got this thing called the Soviet Union out there at the end of World War II, right? And you're not sure whether it's an aggressive state or it's a status quo power. And you come up with policies for dealing with the Soviet Union, right? And then when you marry the policies, right, with the problem, you come up with potential outcomes, okay? And what you do is you rank order those outcomes. In other words, one policy choice would be to contain the Soviet Union. Another policy choice would be to leave Europe and allow the Europeans to contain the Soviet Union. So you see the problem, how to deal with the Soviet Union. Then there are different policies, and policies dealing with specific problems lead to different outcomes. So basically, you get 4 outcomes in this story. And what you do is you rank order those outcomes, and you then assign probabilities, or how likely it is that each one of those outcomes will happen. You do some math that's not terribly complicated, and then you pick the outcome, right, that gives you the greatest benefit or maximizes your utility. That's what's involved here, right? And the argument is, in the international relations literature, among people who employ rational choice theory, that what states do is that they act as if, they don't say they act as if they're expected utility maximizers. That's the definition of rationality. There are all sorts of problems with this. First of all, what does it mean to say that they act as if? They're not saying that if you look at how states behave, they act as expected utility maximizers. They're not saying that they actually use this formula to figure out what the policy options are and then decide on the best policy option. They say they act as if. So you have no sense of what the mental process is. And you all understand that rationality is a mental process. But it says nothing about the mental process. It just says they act as if. Another huge problem with this approach is that you cannot come up with objective probabilities in the social world, in international politics. You cannot come up with objective probabilities to assign to those 4 outcomes. This is a point that was made by John Maynard Keynes and Frank Knight, 2 of the most famous economists of the 20th century. It's not some great insight on the passive by Sebastian Rosado and John Mearsheimer. You cannot come up with objective probabilities. This is widely recognized. So what you do is come up with subjective probabilities. Just to give you an example, how likely do you think it is that Vladimir Putin would use nuclear weapons if Russia were losing in the war in Ukraine? What do you think the probability is? 30%, 20%? You can't assign an objective probability. How can you know? You just can't know. So what you have to rely on are subjective probabilities. So the question is, where do you get subjective probabilities from? Basically, intuition. It's your gut. Get them off the top of your head, right? So you can't come up with objective probabilities. So you can't rank order the outcomes. This causes all sorts of problems. So our argument was that expected utility maximization just doesn't get you very far, because it doesn't tell you anything about the mental process that individuals go through. It's an as-if assumption, right? But furthermore, the actual formula doesn't work because you can't come up with objective probabilities. So that's the problem with rationality in the rational choice world. Then you go over to political psychology, right? In the political psychology world, they assume, just like the rational choice people do, that expected utility maximization is what rationality is. But there's one fundamental difference between the political psychology people and the rational choice people. The political psychology people look to see whether people actually act in accordance with the dictates of expected utility maximization. And unsurprisingly, they find that they don't. And they find that they don't for the same reason that the rational choice people use the as-if assumption. They use the as-if assumption because there's no evidence that people employ expected utility maximization. That's why the rational choice people or the classical economists use the as-if assumption. So it's hardly surprising that the political psychologists find no evidence that people use expected utility maximization. So the question you have to ask yourself is, where does this leave us? Well, for the political psychologists, from a logical point of view, this means that people never act rationally because they never employ expected utility maximization in an uncertain world. And IR is an uncertain world. So what do the political psychology people say? They say that people use heuristics and analogies all the time. Heuristics are basically rules of thumb. Now, the problem with this argument, I mean, there are lots of them. One is, do you think if you're in a crisis and you're the president of the United States, that you're not going to think long and hard about how to get out of this crisis? I think you are. Do you think you're going to use a simple rule of thumb? You're going to use a simple heuristic or a simple-minded analogy? I don't think so. I think you're going to think long and hard about what is the appropriate policy. Another problem with this approach that the political psychologists use, which revolves around heuristics, is much of the research on which the arguments are made is based on experiments in laboratories where they ask individuals what would they do in this situation and what would they do in that situation. Asking college students or even people who have high-powered educations what they would do in a crisis is just a lot different than asking a policymaker in an actual crisis what he or she would do. So there's what we call in the social sciences a huge external validity problem here, right? Furthermore, when you look at the literature on heuristics, what you see is there's just a laundry list of heuristics, right? And you're never told which heuristics are the most important ones and which heuristics apply in this case or that case. So you don't have any sort of theory about how these heuristics fit together that allow you to take that panoply of heuristics and analyze particular cases. Then the final point that I would make to you is if you look at the cases, right? If you look at the cases, there's no evidence of people using heuristics. Or let me put it slightly differently. There's hardly any evidence of people using heuristics, and certainly not in a systematic way. So when you look at the political psychology literature, they're basically arguing people are rational almost all the time. But when you look at the actual behavior, which is based on the assumption that people are using these heuristics, you see no evidence of this. Just one final point before I move on to our approach to dealing with this whole issue. The political psychology people, by and large, this is in the IR field, they look at disasters. Anytime foreign policy ends up producing a disaster, people take that outcome and they reason backwards that it was a result of irrational or non-rational thinking. You cannot do that. We can talk more about that in the discussion later. You cannot equate outcomes with rationality. The fact is, states can be rational and you can get a disastrous outcome. Rationality is a mental process. The question is, what are people thinking about how to deal with a crisis, how to formulate a grand strategy? It's a mental process. It has little to do with outcomes, because you understand that you can be very rational and unforeseen circumstances can complicate matters and produce a disaster. Or you can be very rational, but you can base your approach on bad information simply because you only had bad information. You didn't have the right information. So even though you were rational, you got a disastrous outcome. So you have to separate outcomes from the actual decision-making process. And what the political psychology people do is they focus on disastrous outcomes and then tell you this was the result of an irrational decision. And it's intuitively plausible. It seems to make sense, but you actually can't do that. So our argument is that expected utility maximization, using this magic formula in an uncertain world, right, is not a good definition of rationality. It just isn't. So what we did was we came up with our own definition of rationality. And our argument is that if you're going to come up with an explanation of rationality, you have to look at the individual level, right? The individual level, and then you have to look at the collective level, how those different individuals get together and come up with a final decision. Let's call that the state level, because we're talking here about whether states are rational or not whether individual leaders are rational, because states make collective decisions. Bill Clinton just doesn't decide all alone that he's going to pursue NATO expansion. He's talking to all sorts of his advisors. There's all sorts of input from other people. Okay, so the collective group matters. So our basic argument is that we are theoretical human beings, right? Homo theoreticus. People who focus on rational choice, classical economists, this is Homo economicus. People who focus on political psychology, who focus on heuristics, those are Homo heuristicus. So you have Homo heuristicus, Homo economicus. We're Homo theoreticus. Sebastian and I believe that human beings are theoretically oriented at the core. And when a state or an individual is thinking about how to deal with a foreign policy problem, you think about that problem in terms of the theories that you have in your head about how the world works. It's very important to understand that. And the question is whether the theories that people have in their head are credible theories, or non-credible theories. And our argument is you can break the theoretical world into credible theories and non-credible theories. The domino theory, for example, is a non-credible theory, okay? Forcible democracy promotion, the idea that you could forcibly promote democracy and it's going to work. It's a non-credible theory. Then there are all sorts of credible theories of a realist sort and a liberal sort. So there are two bodies of theory here that produce a good number of credible theories. And our argument is that individuals, right, are rational. Individuals are rational when they have a credible theory that allows them to think about how to deal with a particular foreign policy problem. Okay? Now, before I go to talking about the collective level, let me just say a few more words about credible theories. A lot of people who we talked to when we wrote this book believe that there's only one credible theory. That's my theory. And therefore, any state that acts the way my theory says it should is rational. And if you don't, you're irrational or non-rational. This is not an argument you want to make. What this means is that two realists like Sebastian and I, who have particular theories about how the world works, are going to say that other realist theories that we disagree with and liberal theories are credible theories, and therefore policies based on those credible theories are rational. It's very important to understand that. We are not arguing if you don't agree with us and you don't adopt our theories, you're irrational. That's not our argument. And let me give you a really good example that highlights this and is of relevance today when people talk about Ukraine. NATO expansion. There was a big battle in the 1990s. You guys both remember it very well, over NATO expansion. On one side were the realists, people like George Kennan, Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense, and so forth and so on. They argued that NATO expansion was a fundamentally misguided idea because it would lead the Russians to balance and you'd have a disaster. On the other side were the liberals, and the liberals believed that you could expand NATO, you could expand the EU, and you could facilitate the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. You could pursue a set of liberal theories, right? Democratic peace theory, liberal institutionalism, and economic interdependence theory. That's what underpinned NATO expansion as it moved eastward. Those are theories that Sebastian and I disagree with. We think those theories are wrong, right? Because we're realists and we thought differently about NATO expansion. But we are not arguing that the ultimate decision to expand NATO, which was based on a body of 3 liberal theories, was irrational. It was not irrational. It was rational because it was based on 3 of the most prominent theories in international politics. So you see the argument that I'm making here? That you want to be very careful not to identify rationality with your favorite theory. The question is whether a theory is credible. And to have a theory be credible, it has to have sound assumptions. It has to make empirical predictions for which there's quite a bit of evidence to support that prediction, and it has to have a sound causal logic. Democratic peace theory, for example, is a theory that is quite robust. As a good realist, I find democratic peace theory to be the most difficult of the liberal theories to argue against. You can't dismiss it. It is a rational theory, even though I think, and Sebastian certainly thinks, because he wrote a very prominent article on this, that it is a wrong-headed theory, okay? Now, just very quickly, just to give you one example of a policy that we believe was non-rational. This is the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. And it was based on 4 theories. A theory of victory, shock and awe, which we think was rational. It was based on democratic peace theory. I could go through the details, which we think was a rational theory, as I just made clear. But it was also based on 2 theories. Here I'm talking about the decision to invade Iraq. It was based on 2 theories that were not rational. One was democratic, forcible democracy promotion. Forcible democracy promotion. The idea that you could forcibly push Iraq to become a democracy. The theoretical literature on there is quite clear. Literature on this is quite clear. And the other is the domino theory, right? The Bush doctrine, as it applied to Iraq, was based on the domino theory. Domino theory and forcible democracy promotion, not rational theories. So our argument is the Iraq case was not rational. The decision to expand NATO was rational because it was based on a body of liberal theories that are credible theories. So you see the importance to us of credible theories. Then there's the whole matter of deliberation, which you always want to remember when you're thinking about this question of whether states are rational, is that decisions are invariably made by a handful of people. Sebastian and I used to like to refer to a handful of people in the room. A number of key policymakers in almost every case make the decision. And in almost every case, not every case, but almost every case, they have different theories and therefore different policies. Because you understand John and Sebastian's argument is policy is based on theory. Policy is based on theory. So when you get in the room, you discover that people have different theories that they prefer and therefore different policy prescriptions. Think of the NATO expansion debate, okay? So the end result is that you have to have a collective decision-making process where people get to make their positions clear. Their arguments are not suppressed. It's a rational legal discussion, right? And the end result of this is if you get a policy that is based on a credible theory and it's done in a way where there's robust discussion at the collective level, it is rational. If you have a policy that is based on a non-credible theory, or there's no deliberation, or there's neither, then you have irrationality or non-rationality. Let me very briefly conclude by just talking about the evidence. We looked at 14 cases, 10 cases of rationality, and 4 cases of non-rationality. What we did was we scoured the literature to find the cases that people who argued that states are irrational invariably turn to make their case. We looked for those cases, okay? Then we put them up in bright lights and we examined them, okay? So we have 10 cases of rationality and we have 4 cases of non-rationality. As you all surely understand, there are many, many cases that we could have investigated, but given time constraints, that was impossible. So again, what we did was we focused on these 14 cases, and we went to great lengths to show that our definition of rationality actually fit quite neatly with those 14 cases, and that in those 14 cases, you saw little evidence of policymakers using heuristics, and you, of course, saw little evidence of policymakers using expected utility maximization. And for that reason, we felt that we came up with a quite convincing argument. But whether or not that is true depends on how you interpret my presentation and the book. Thank you.